Well, we have a little bit of a smaller crew here today, as is somewhat reasonable to expect given the amount of content that there's been over the past 2 days, but we love the crew that persists, and we're grateful. Guy, I don't know if you made an announcement yet. I think yesterday. Excited to get going.
Did do an announcement, so we'll see if more folks trickle in.
Great. I think I'm gonna share my screen now and let's get started. All right, so we're gonna pick up where we left off yesterday, which is the LP gauge, and the LP gauge system allows Beanstalk to distribute seeds arbitrarily to deposit various LP tokens, in an attempt to move the current BDV distribution to some predefined optimal LP BDV distribution. Properly setting that optimal LP BDV distribution is, as we were talking about yesterday, in my opinion, one of the most difficult and interesting questions facing Beanstalk at this point. Does Beanstalk live and die by the wisdom of the DAO, or the wisdom of the crowd, if you will? Otherwise, how can it set optimal exposure to the market? What even is optimal exposure to the market for a stablecoin protocol like Beanstalk? What types of assets should it be targeting liquidity against? It's a very interesting series of questions that are worthy of study. The LP gauge may be useful for macro signaling, meaning would the DAO prefer USDT exposure versus USDC exposure versus 3-curve exposure for its stablecoin exposure? But it's probably pretty dangerous if it starts to be used for aggressive position management and taking a lot of directional bets. So in general, I think treading lightly with the LP gauge system is how people should be thinking about things. Meaning, it makes total sense for the DAO to have a preference for USDT versus USDC versus 3-curve versus ETH exposure, but when it comes to toggling the ETH exposure every 2 weeks, that's a really tricky business to start to get into. It's not to say that Beanstalk shouldn't be changing its definition of optimal LP BDV distribution in some autonomous fashion at some point in the future. It's really complicated to do it. So with all that in mind, the initial implementation of the LP gauge system is particularly simple. First, an optimal BDV ratio is determined arbitrarily via BIP, and then it's static. When new assets are whitelisted, their optimal BDV ratio must be set as well. All others are reweighted accordingly unless explicitly changed. At the beginning of each season, Beanstalk measures the actual BDV ratio relative to the optimal BDV ratio for each asset on the LP gauge whitelist. Now, this measurement is it greater than or less than? Currently, there's no notion of magnitude, and there's also no notion of rate of change of magnitude or rate of change of position with regards to optimal. It's just a measurement of position relative to optimal currently. And then based on whether the asset is under-allocated or over-allocated, it either receives one more or less point. So if the asset is under-allocated relative to optimal, it receives one more LP gauge point at the sunrise. And on the other hand, if the asset has too much exposure relative to optimal, it receives one less LP gauge point. And then the seed gauge system will, based on the overall peg maintenance mechanism, determine how much from stock or how many seeds go to the LP during that season. And then based on the LP gauge point per asset, those assets will then receive grown stock, and then in order to prevent an asset for gaining an excessive amount of points that then can never come down, basically, sort of like what's happened to the temperature now. The max LP gauge points possible for a given asset should be 10 to the x, where x is a parameter that Beanstalk can set arbitrarily. So there's some very interesting future work on the LP gauge system, research into how setting those optimal levels of LP BDV distribution in a distributed way. That's a really interesting problem. Research into more understanding of how the state space works for LP, because mostly it's the same for every asset. Like, it's just Beanstalk, it's hard for it to measure each asset differently in the features in terms of how is the market going to treat one asset differently versus the other. And therefore, keeping it pretty simple for now is obviously the right thing to do. But future research into how the market has responded to various changes in gauge points over time, and whether that's different for different assets, that's a worthy thing to study at some point in the future. But we need a lot more data in practice in order to study that. And then based on that, you could do more research into a more sophisticated response to position and its derivatives. Now, even currently, you could add to the LP gauge system some sort of change in position over time. That's possible. So season to season, is it getting closer or further away, more than just position? So that's a potential upgrade as well. So that's the LP gauge system. That's sort of rounding out the seed gauge system overall, which again has those three new peg maintenance tools, one primary and two secondary. And now there's a couple RFCs that are suggested by this study overall that we've been doing. One is a soil issuance change. Given the importance of minimizing the excessive issuance of debt and thereby entering a death spiral, Beanstalk should issue soil as the minimum of the time-weighted average SMA of delta B and the instantaneous EMA of delta B. And so the point is, as we've seen, in order to minimize the chances that Beanstalk goes into the hole, particularly the high debt level hole, which is the death spiral hole, Beanstalk should minimize soil issuance as much as possible, while still making sure that it's issuing enough soil to return the price to peg. It's doing its primary peg maintenance job. So the point is that by using the minimum of the time-weighted average SMA and the instantaneous EMA, the latter of which is measured over a shorter period of time, its more current measurement, Beanstalk can minimize how much soil it has to issue. So it measures over the full season, the delta B, and then it measures over the more recent period in a manipulation-resistant fashion, and it takes the minimum of the two. So it can minimize soil issuance, which is good for the overall health of Beanstalk in the long term. In the short term, it may mean that there's slightly less peg maintenance with respect to price, but Beanstalk is very happy to make a short-term downside peg maintenance trade-off for long-term health with respect to debt. That's always a good trade-off. And then we talked about this over the previous 2 days, but the generalized flood, not the generalized FUD. That's pretty funny, generalized FUD. In addition to being upgradable to be able to sell down to PEG or V across multiple liquidity pools, it makes sense to make the following changes to the trigger for a flood. And it's basically to add independent triggers for price and debt level, include the L2SR as well with an independent trigger, and then reset the maximum temperature and the seed gauge weighting to entirely favor LP, basically to 0 in the instance that there is a flood. So that sort of wraps up all of the changes suggested by the seed gauge system and this overall study on position and the state space. with the exception of the generalized convert component. So before we get into that, maybe it makes sense to just pause for a second to see if anyone has any questions. Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah, I just want to add that the current maximum temperature minimum is 1. So, unless there's a reason to push it to 0, we'd probably want to change that to reset it to 1.
Great shout. Pizza Man asks, you mentioned earlier wishing that temp would raise slower. Would you consider a short-term RFC for that? Think that it probably makes sense to include the proposed changes to the temperature with the seed gauge bit. So, short answer is yes. But in terms of an RFC, I think it just makes sense to add it to the seed gauge. Therefore. I have no idea if they're covered to respond. That would be a question for the devs. All right. Let's do this thing. Generalized convert. Excuse me.
I guess just to address Peace Man's question, what temp changes are you referring to? Just changing the cases?
He's talking about switching the actual changes in temperature. Basically switching the cases where the price is less than V and the debt level is below DR star versus above DR star, because based on the analysis that has been done, it seems like Beanstalk is actually better off being more aggressive at raising the temperature at lower debt levels when it would rather issue more debt, whereas it should be less aggressive at raising the temperature at higher debt levels when it would rather not issue as much debt, whereas currently it does the opposite. Which is, if you're looking at if you're looking at the screen, you can go back and see. Covered a lot of ground here. I don't know very physically that just for all and so. No, it's like very small. I think it was. I don't know. Hard to know.
I mean, as far as I'm aware, no changes to the temperature mechanism. Any changes that actually change the temperature mechanism itself have not been coded, other than the expansion of the cases in the seed gauge system. So, any change that would just require changing the cases can be done fairly trivially, but any change that changes what the cases are or how the cases affect things would require step work.
Yeah, I don't know where this slide is. For some reason, it's eluding us. Unless someone has the slide number, which would be great. Just to reference. But I don't think we have it. Let's see.
I can't find it either.
What's up with that? We might even have it like twice. That's the funny part. Clearly. Oh. No, this isn't. Let's gotta come after that. Apologies. No, this doesn't make for good content, but I think it's good to just go back and reference our previous answer. Super weird. I don't understand. Oh, here it is. Boom. This is the discussion, which according to Brendan has not been typed up, which makes sense. But the idea is to switch, in the case we have low price, to basically switch how aggressive Beanstalk is between low debt level and high debt level. And it would in that case then be more aggressive at a low debt level and less aggressive at a high debt level. And that's in line with.
Well, it seems like it's just a matter of changing the numbers, right? Which means that it would be, just a matter of changing the cases and doesn't require any development work.
Correct. Correct. So I think it should be trivial to implement if people think that makes sense. Great. Generalized convert. Let's do it. Generalized convert is the second half of the upgrade to the Beanstalk peg maintenance model that allows the silo to become much more integrated with the model's response to current state at the beginning of each season. There's currently an immense amount of friction converting between LP tokens within the silo. Generalized convert is necessary to allow the LP gate system to work properly. So in practice, we just talked about the LP gate system. It doesn't work if you can't convert from LP to LP, and currently the cases in which you can do that are highly limited. There's no way to just go back and forth as you wish to change your own individual exposure within the silo, which is obviously a big problem in terms of Beanstalk's ability to affect peg maintenance. So the convert is necessary. The two upgrades are also complementary because beyond the ability to apply a penalty and bonus for conversions, whereas seed gauge is able to respond to the current state of Beanstalk by changing the incentives for converting via changing the distribution of seeds to LP versus beans and amongst LP tokens, the benefits of which are realized over time, the generalized convert creates the opportunity for Beanstalk to respond to its current state by offering a conversion incentive or disincentive whose benefits and penalties are realized immediately via a stock bonus and penalty system. The first question is, how should Beanstalk classify a convert? Classifying conversions. Some key questions to answer in determining what the relevant features of a convert are. 1.1, what are the relevant axes dimensions on and in which to evaluate a convert? Sounds familiar, right? 1.2, which data to use to evaluate a convert along each axis? 1.3, how should Beanstalk evaluate a convert along each axis in practice? So this is a slightly abridged version of the same analysis that was being done for the Beanstalk state space. Now, the relevant axes and dimensions to evaluate a convert are as follows. There's lambda to lambda converts, which are if you want to combine deposits, you want to update the BDV, you don't actually change the asset. You could call that maybe like a 1-to-1 convert. And then the LP to bean, and maybe it would even be more accurate to say like it's like it is properly named. It's lambda to lambda, the thing to itself. The LP to bean is a convert that decreases delta B, and bean to LP is a convert that increases. No, that's backwards. LP to bean increases, and delta B, yes. But the point is LP to bean and bean to LP conversions they affect delta B. And then LPX to LPY, they change the BDV distribution. They change the liquidity pools. And then you have special cases of converts, which are the chop convert, where you go from unripe to the normal asset. And then you have the unripe LP to bean and unripe bean to LP. But those are, this is really a subset of the lambda to lambda. And then the unripe LP to bean is a subset of number 2. And this is really a subset of number 3 in terms of how to think about it in terms of peg maintenance. Now, lambda to lambda converts are to maximize the ease in which farmers can use their deposits to their full potential. In certain instances, it may be beneficial to change the season of deposit of multiple deposits. For example, a contract only accepts deposits from or after a certain season, or combine deposits to save gas in the future. When the BDV logged in the silo is less than the current BDV of the deposit, farmers may want to pay gas to update their BDV upwards. Therefore, the primary axis to evaluate lambda to lambda converts on is how the distribution of grown stock for BDV changes, which is to say the opportunity cost for withdrawing any BDV, how is that changing based on the convert? And in particular, Beanstalk is concerned that there is no decrease in opportunity cost for any BDV as a result of the convert when adjusted for decreases in grown stock. So if you're going to withdraw BDV from the silo after the convert, there shouldn't be any change in the grown stock per BDV and in the opportunity cost that you're going to realize withdrawing any amount of BDV. That's what is important from the lambda to lambda perspective. Any amount of BDV. So whether you're going to withdraw 1 BDV after the convert, or 100 BDV, or 1,000 BDV, or 1,000,000 BDV after the convert, the opportunity cost, the grown stock that you're going to have to forfeit, should not have changed as a result of the convert, other than when adjusting for changes in BDV and the bonus and penalty, which we'll address specifically. Now, LP to bean converts increase delta B immediately and decrease L2SR over time. This is something we talked about yesterday. And bean to LP converts decrease delta B immediately and increase L2SR over time. This is something we also talked about yesterday. So delta B is the primary axis over which LP to bean and bean to LP converts should be evaluated. So now we have the distribution of grown stock to BDV. We have the change in delta BDV and the change in delta B, excuse me. And then for LPX to LPY converts, they do not affect delta B or the L2SR other than via lost BDV to slippage in the trades. Therefore, how Beanstalk treats LPX to LPY converts need not factor into the overall peg maintenance system in terms of price, direction, acceleration with respect to overall position, the three-dimensional space we were discussing over the previous 2 days, and should only be considered in the context of the LP gauge system. Beanstalk does not want any LPX to LPY converts when X is underweight and Y is overweight compared to the optimal LP BDV distribution. Generalized convert does not explicitly enforce a rule that farmers are not allowed to do this. The same for bean to LB converts now. Instead, using a grown stock penalty can properly discourage doing so, perhaps by mimicking the same concept. However, now it's applied via a penalty instead of prohibited entirely. Therefore, some measure of effect on LP BDV distribution relative to potential effect on LP BDV distribution is the primary axis over which to evaluate LPX to LPY converts. So what this is trying to say is, given how much you could have affected, how much LP BDV distribution changing you did, how much of it was helpful to the overall state of LP BDV distribution, and how much of it was hurtful. And then based on that, you should be rewarded or penalized accordingly. So those are the 3 axes: the distribution of grown stock across BDV, the change in delta B, and the change in LP BDV distribution. Now, question 1.2. what data to use to evaluate a convert along each axis. Now, when you think about generalized convert, what do you think? You think you can convert anything to any set of assets to any set of assets? Now, we would call that an n by n convert. You can load in n assets, you can convert them to n assets, or m assets, but the point is it's arbitrarily large in both directions. You can mix and match and do whatever you want. However, allowing multiple different assets to be input into the convert allows the swapping of opportunity costs between assets, which is a way to ultimately manipulate the system by avoiding the bonus or penalty system. So, for example, if you have 100 BDV of Bean USDC with 0 grown stock and 100 BDV of Bean ETH with 100 grown stock, and you switch it, you switch the grown stock, that type of conversion allows for the circumvention of the bonus and penalty system. Because if you have only one of those assets that has 100 grown stock, and you ultimately want to convert it to the other one, which normally you'd be exposed to a bonus or a penalty because you're moving BDB directionally, if there's an n by n convert, you could just buy the other asset, deposit it at that point in time, convert and switch the stock. But because there's no switch in BDV, Beanstalk's not going to be able to evaluate what just happened. It's just looking at generalized rules of the convert. It's not looking at what was converted to what specifically, and therefore afterwards you can withdraw the other asset, and then it's effectively like you did the convert that you wanted to, but you didn't actually get exposed to the bonus and penalty system. And this obviously you want to avoid. And so while it's suboptimal, Beanstalk can still create an n by n conversion experience through the combination of n by 1 conversions in a single pipeline transaction. And an n by 1 conversion is where there's only one destination asset. And if you think about it, having only one destination asset solves this potential problem. Now, when we think about it, now we're going to apply this n by 1 conversion framework to each of these axes. So the first is the change in the distribution of grown stock per BDV. When evaluating an n by 1 convert, the fundamental principle is that the opportunity cost of withdrawing any amount of BDV from the silo after the conversion should be greater than or equal to the opportunity cost of withdrawing the same amount of BDV from the silo before the conversion. This principle prevents manipulation of opportunity cost via generalized converts when combined with the limitation that it's an n by 1 convert. Therefore, the grown stock per BDV in and out of the convert, each sorted in ascending order by grown stock, is needed to efficiently ensure compliance with this rule. And we'll see why in a little bit. Change in delta B. When evaluating an n by 1 convert, the change in delta B is either helpful or hurtful in terms of peg maintenance, particularly with respect to price. Therefore, Beanstalk must measure the change in delta B, delta B, as a result of the convert and compare it to the BDV input to the convert. The ratio U equals delta B over BDV in is the best metric for how aligned was the convert with the Beanstalk's peg maintenance in terms of delta B. U would be somewhere between -1 and 1. The closer to -1, the larger the decrease in delta B. The closer to 1, the larger the increase in delta B. And then, of course, depending on whether Beanstalk was above or below peg, U would then be an indicator of how aligned was the convert with Beanstalk. Now, the change in LP BDV distribution. When evaluating an n by 1 convert, the change in LP BDV distribution is neither helpful nor harmful in terms of overall Beanstalk state, as we discussed. However, it is either helpful or hurtful to the LP gauge system, which is a secondary peg maintenance component. Therefore, Beanstalk should still measure the change in LP BDV distribution with respect to optimal delta LP as a result of the convert and compare it to the BDV input to the convert. The ratio S equals delta LP over BDV in is one metric for how aligned was the convert with Beanstalk's peg maintenance in terms of LP BDV distribution. A more sophisticated peg maintenance mechanism could factor in how far each LP is from its optimal optimal distribution and weigh certain conversions in delta LP more than others. So maybe converting one asset that is more important to be close to optimal because it's particularly volatile and Beanstalk doesn't want too much exposure to it would be more meaningful to Beanstalk than another convert, another more typical convert, average convert. This is certainly a subject for future working research. Now, we get to the more practical question. How should Beanstalk evaluate a convert along each axis in practice? Let's start with the change in distribution of grown stock per BDV. Before we do that, I'm just going to quickly check the chat, make sure we're not missing anything important. Doesn't seem like it. When evaluating an n/1 convert, the fundamental principle, as we discussed, is that the opportunity cost of withdrawing any amount of BDV from the silo after the conversion should be greater than or equal to the opportunity cost for withdrawing the same amount of BDV from the silo before the conversion. Now, this equation, which sums up at all points of BDV from I to BDV in, Beanstalk is summing up the total grown stock and comparing the grown stock in relative to the grown stock out. And it is making sure that the opportunity cost, which can be thought of as the total grown stock or the y-axis here, out for all BDV is greater than or equal to the total grown stock for the grown stock in. So that the opportunity cost is greater than or equal to at all points. This is an important rule that the system has to enforce in order to make sure that there's no manipulation. Otherwise, if you could do something like that and then that, you could have a lot of grown stock, a lot of deposits out after the convert that there's way less opportunity cost. So it's very important that these two lines, the grown stock in line is less than or equal to at all points grown stock out line. Now, there are 4 special cases, as I briefly mentioned earlier, that must be accounted for by this formula. BDV increases, BDV decreases, applying the grown stock bonus, and applying the grown stock penalty. Now, the basic intuition for how to apply the BDV increase is that BDV increases can happen for a variety of reasons, and Beanstalk wants to avoid the creation of new deposits with no grown stock. So, for example, you have an LP token that the BDV has increased. Beanstalk wants to avoid the ability to mint a new deposit that credits you for the BDV with no grown stock on it, so that you could, in theory, withdraw some of the BDV from the system. Guys, you posted the chart. Is that because you can't see my screen?
There's a question right above it. I was asking if you could explain why the grown stock lines are shaped like that.
Oh. Well, each deposit has some amount of BDV, so they're sort of like they're lines where the total grown stock is increasing at a constant rate because the deposit has a constant amount of stock for grown stock per BDV, but it changes per deposit, and each of them are ordered in ascending order. So the slope is increasing, the grown stock per BDV order.
And why do they converge?
Because in theory, you don't want to lose any grown stock as a result of the conversion. So in a neutral place where there's no bonus or penalty or change in BDV, the expectation would be that they converge to the same endpoint so that there's no loss in grown stock or BDV.
Cool.
So there are 4 special cases that have to be treated for this comparison. The first, BDV increases. As we were talking about, the intuition is that Beanstalk doesn't want there to be any new BDV created with no grown stock that then can be withdrawn immediately. So instead, it should apply, basically, it should apply the increase in BDV across all grown stock evenly. And what that looks like in practice in this equation is to multiply the grown stock in by the minimum of 1 or BDV in over BDV out. So it's going to be some value less than or equal to 1, which will scale down the line G in. So it'll sort of scale this line down, but then it will also stretch out in practice because there's more BDV happening here. So the G out line will go longer than G in. So G in, I guess the purple line, once it flattens out because there's no more BDV, the way the comparison would sort of just flatline. So then even if the purple line ends up having more BDV, something like that, it can take all of that space if there's a real BDV increase. But the point is that the GN will have been lowered to factor that in. Now, the BDV decrease sort of works in the opposite way. The intuition here is that including withdrawing value from the system, there's a lot of different ways to manipulate the system through the BDV decreases. So you do a convert, and the BDV in is significantly more than the BDV out. Beanstalk doesn't know whether that was from slippage from a bad trade, whether you just took out value and put it in your wallet. It doesn't know. So it needs to properly account for BDV decreases, and it has to impose a penalty in the form of a loss of grown stock associated with the lost BDV. So Beanstalk knows that there was some BDV in and some grown stock in, and some percentage of the BDV in was lost. Therefore, some percentage of the grown stock has to be lost. Now, there's a couple different ways that Beanstalk can handle this situation. One is that it can enforce the distribution of the decrease in BDV evenly across all grown stock. Another is that it can allow the distribution of the lost grown stock arbitrarily, or it can enforce the distribution of the lost grown stock is by the BDV with the least grown stock per BDV. Now, all 3 options, of course, enforce the loss of the proportional amount of grown stock associated with the loss of BDV. However, option 3 leaves the depositor with the highest opportunity cost after the conversion is completed. So losing BDV is the least is made very unattractive for the converter. So they bear the full cost, and in practice the maximum cost that Beanstalk could apply from a game theory perspective in this case when there's BDV decreases. And then, of course, BDV decreases would also affect delta B, which Beanstalk can handle in the bonus and penalty system. Now, another case is when there's a grown stock bonus. While the component of convert that this formula is addressing, that is ensuring opportunity cost for withdrawing after convert is maximized, is entirely independent from the bonus and penalty system, the formula must be able to account for the bonus and penalty to be applied. So what this is saying is that the determination of the bonus and penalty system really has nothing to do with the grown stock distribution check. As long as the convert passes the grown stock distribution check, everything's hunky-dory. However, the grown stock distribution guide has to factor in the bonus and penalty. So how to apply the penalty and the bonus? The intuition is that when Beanstalk awards extra grown stock for converts that help Beanstalk, it can either enforce the distribution of the bonus grown stock across a particular BDV, or it can allow the distribution of stock arbitrarily across BDV. Now, both options enforce the same gain in grown stock associated with the bonus. However, option 2 leaves farmers much more flexibility with no downside for Beanstalk compared to option 1. Therefore, option 2 is used. Now, in order to enable the bonus to be applied, it's obviously a lot easier. Maybe it's not so obvious, but in practice, it is much easier to apply the bonus in this fashion, in an arbitrary fashion, with the help of the ordering of deposits by ascension of grown stock per BDV from least to greatest. So in practice, the bonus can be allowed to be applied arbitrarily through the distribution of the bonus evenly across the BDV input to the n/1 conversion. So in this case, we're going to sort of do the opposite of the BDV in thing, and we're going to multiply it by some ratio that is greater than 1. And therefore increase the actual amount of grown stock that can come out of this as well. And for reference here in this equation, B is the bonus and T is the total grown stock input to the convert. So now in addition to minus this min between 1 and BDV in over BDV out, it's also multiplied by 1 plus B over T. Now, finally, we have the fourth case, which is the grown stock penalty. And similar to the bonus, it's totally independent, but the system has to be able to apply. The intuition is that the total grown stock is haircut by 1 minus the penalty. Beanstalk can, in practice, 1, enforce the distribution of the lost grown stock evenly across all BDV. 2, allow the distribution of the lost grown stock arbitrarily across BDV. Or 3, enforce the distribution of the lost grown stock is by the BDV with the least grown stock per BDV. Each option enforces the loss of the same amount of grown stock associated with the penalty. However, option 2 leaves the potential to decrease the opportunity cost for withdrawing some BDV to near 0, which of course Beanstalk wants to avoid. Option 3 is less applicable here than comparing the covering the BDV decrease or the bonus, because in that case, there's the potential for a disguised withdrawal. I guess not the bonus, just the BDV decrease. Didn't realize where that sentence is going. So option 3 is less applicable here than compared to covering the BDV decrease, because in that case, there's a potential for a disguised withdrawal, and the effect is in some respects a withdrawal of BDV from the silo, whereas in this case, there's a penalty being applied across all deposits. What was the parentheses? So Beanstalk uses option 1, which again is to enforce the distribution of the lost grown stock evenly across all BDV. So it's just another term that it multiplies the left side of the equation by, in this case, 1 minus 2. So if this equation is true, the change in distribution of grown stock per BDV is acceptable to Beanstalk. Now, it's important that Beanstalk uses manipulation-resistant values as inputs into this. So BDV in, grown stock in, and grown stock out are all per BDV, both values are all Beanstalk native values that can be queried without risk of manipulation because they are downstream of other manipulation-resistant components like the deposit system. BDV out should use the multi-flow pump instantaneous EMA for BDV at the time of conversion. Similarly, Beanstalk should use the multi-flow pump instantaneous EMA to determine the delta B and at the time of conversion. Using the multi-flow instantaneous EMA for BDV and delta B is somewhat inefficient in practice because the EMA has some sort of lag. But as of now, this is the least amount of lag without a loss of multi-block MEV manipulation resistance possible. And so even though there is some lag in accuracy of the data, it's the least amount possible. And therefore, we think it's the best source of data that Beanstalk has available at the moment. Shout out Brendan for all the really cool work that he did on the pump. I think that it's going to be deeply meaningful over time. Change in delta B, we talked about this value U, which is between -1 and 1, which is calculated using the change in delta B, delta B, and the total convert of the BDV in. Delta B can be measured based on the BDV before and after the convert, and BDV in is already manipulation resistant. So there's not a large problem there. And then when it comes to the change in the LP BDV distribution, the optimal BDV of each whitelisted asset is determined by the product of its percentage of LP BDV points and the total LP BDV in the silo, one of which is set by the Dow, and the other is can be measured. Each whitelisted asset has some delta BDV. I'm not sure how the total LP BDV in the silo is determined actually in this system in practice. I assume it's some sort of sum of the deposits in the silo. That would make the most sense. But I see Brain just came up here, so maybe he can bail me out of this one. Mr. Brain, are you there, sir?
Yes. What was the question?
How you doing, sir? How you doing?
Doing good. How are you?
Doing well, thank you. The question is, how does the LP gauge system and the generalized convert system measure the total LP BDV in the silo?
Yes. So currently, the LP VDV is the summation of all the BDV of the deposits, rather than, let's say, the instantaneous BDV of the amounts of the silo. With the germination update, this will exclude the latest deposits from the first 2 seasons.
Thank you. So I was more or less right, but not exactly. Each whitelisted asset has some delta BDV between the actual BDV and the optimal BDV. Let's call this set of values delta BDV star. The convert has some effect on the actual BDV of potentially every LP. Let's call this a set of effects delta BDV. The bonus and penalty system can evaluate delta BDV star, delta BDV, and BDV in order to determine what the appropriate bonus and penalty should be. Delta BDV star can be calculated using the silo native values of BDV and total BDV in the silo. Neither requires special treatment to be manipulation resistant. Delta BDV can be measured based on the BDV before and after the convert. BDV in is already manipulation resistant. So that's how Beanstalk achieves manipulation resistance for all this, measuring all these assets along all these indices. Now we get to something fun. How should Beanstalk respond to a convert in terms of acceptance, bonus, and penalty? Responding to conversions. 2.1. Under what conversion should Beanstalk accept a convert? 2.2. How should Beanstalk determine the appropriate bonus and penalty amounts? 2.3. How should Beanstalk use these tools in practice? So Beanstalk should accept an n/1 convert if and only if the Growstock distribution check that handles all 4 special cases passes. So if this check passes, then Beanstalk should accept the convert. Now, how should Beanstalk determine the appropriate bonus and penalty amounts? Given Beanstalk's understanding of its current state and the convert in question, its effect on delta B and the LP BDV distribution, how should Beanstalk evaluate the appropriate bonus and penalty to apply? This is a very, very complicated question, of course, and I think people can understand the complexity of the question given the complexity of the space that Beanstalk is already in. So given its position, direction, and acceleration in the space that we were just talking about, how should the convert's effect on delta B and LP BDV distribution, how should Beanstalk think about that? Now, some things are more obvious, like don't convert so that delta B moves in the wrong direction. Some things are a lot less obvious, like how should Beanstalk factor in a BDV, an LP conversion of being USDC to being ETH when ETH has just gone up 200% in terms of its exposure in the silo versus when it's gone down 50%. So these are very interesting questions. However, in its most simple form, a complete bonus and penalty system could include a bonus function and a penalty function that take in current state, U, delta BDV, and delta BDV star, and output values between 0 and 1. So a pair of values between 0 and 1 that are the bonus and penalty respectively. However, properly accounting for these things, there's nearly infinite complexity. And so there's no analysis in the future that can be done there's no amount of excess analysis that can be done. There will always be more analysis to be done on the right way to set up these bonus and penalty systems. However, I just throw this out there. There's a limit to the effect of the bonus and penalty, of course. So while it's infinitely complex, it's not in most cases a primary peg maintenance tool, with the exception of the delta B effect from LP to Bean and Bean to LP. Now, how should Beanstalk determine the appropriate bonus and penalty amounts? In order to prevent people from withdrawing, selling, redepositing, and then converting back to the original asset to gain extra Growstock, there is a limit to how much Growstock can be given out as a bonus. There's a maximum bonus. So even though in theory you could have a super complex system to determine what the bonus should be, there's actually a tight limit on what the maximum bonus should be. And again, that is in ascending order, the Growstock per BDV of the destination asset. So the larger Beanstalk grows and the more recent deposits there are, the less the bonus can actually be. So because Beanstalk doesn't know who owns what, and so it has to treat the whole system as a whole, is the short answer. So in short, the maximum bonus is highly limited. A more basic max bonus system just uses the minimum Growstock per BDV for the destination asset. But if the goal is to offer larger bonuses, which I think it's a reasonable goal, then Beanstalk should try to use. It would require it to store it, but in ascending order, the Growstock per BDV of each deposit in some capacity. Now, in theory, the bonus should be a product of the return value of the bonus function, which takes into account the state of Beanstalk and all of those other things, and the maximum bonus. There is no similar limit to the penalty. The penalty can be between 0 and 100%, but it can't be 1,000%. That doesn't really seem reasonable. How should Beanstalk use these tools in practice? It is if sufficiently gas efficient. That's a mouthful. The maximum bonus should be calculated as the sum of grown stock of the BDV of the destination asset with the least grown stock in the silo at the time of conversion up to BDVN. Otherwise, just the minimum grown stock per BDV can be stored and used instead. That's what I was saying before. For now, the penalty system should apply a 100% penalty for assets that moved out to be further from 0%, and a 0% asset, a 0% penalty for assets that moved out to be closer to 0. So that basically would mimic the current system. Whether to apply a linear penalty of something for I don't really understand what the sentence says, but determining a more complex penalty is very complex. It is unclear how much the LP-BDV distribution should factor into the penalty and bonus system compared to delta B. For now, it is not included in the bonus and penalty system, but certainly could be, and likely should be for future implementations. This is just because the LP-BDV distribution is a secondary peg maintenance mechanism that we don't have any data on, whereas the bean to LP and LP bean conversions is something that there's a lot of data on, is a primary peg maintenance mechanism. So while the two could be intertwined in the future, for now, it probably makes the most sense to just mimic the current system and then evaluate how things work once the seed gauge goes into effect with the generalized convert before trying to tweak things on this front. Research into setting the appropriate penalty based on U. Research into determining the optimal way to understand the effect of converting LP BDV distribution, meaning which types of LP BDV distribution converts are better for Beanstalk, and research into a more sophisticated way to determine the appropriate bonus relative to the maximum and the penalty. These are all subjects for future work on this front. But it's a very interesting topic in practice. I just said all this stuff. Now, there's a couple RFCs to discuss briefly that are related to this. The first is the BDV decrease, and the other is removing the 10 block delay in earned bean issuance and replacing it with something else. So with regards to the BDV decrease, because of the ability to update BDV of deposits upwards, it is now possible for farmers to be credited for upside volatility in the BDV of their deposits, which is wonderful. However, when their deposits experience downside volatility, Beanstalk is currently still evaluating the BDV deposit. This is a problem because stale data is fed into the peg maintenance mechanism. The solution is to allow anyone to update the BDV of a deposit down. This should create more efficiency in the peg maintenance mechanism. It's a little bit of like a dick move, like downgrading someone's BDV deposits. But that's one potential solution. Potentially a better solution would be for continuous BDV updating at every sunrise call by Beanstalk. But if there's going to be this potential for like a dick move, there's the potential for a system to top up BDV via tractor, where potentially someone could issue a tractor blueprint that says, if someone is going to update my BDV downwards, front run them to top up the deposit with more BDV. Such a system would likely be beneficial to Beanstalk, but it's a little ridiculous. So maybe calculating the BDV at the start of every sunrise is better. It's probably going to be more expensive though for the sunrise. So something to look into in the future. Then with respect to the minting delay strategy, Beanstalk always has to prevent manipulation in the form of buying and depositing, calling the sunrise to receive a bean mint, and then withdrawing and selling. Because the minting of new beans happens during the sunrise, the only way to prevent this manipulation occurring is to either delay the distribution of the earned beans for some amount of time until after the sunrise call, and distribute the earned beans only to stock that existed at the sunrise call and still existed at the time of distribution. So stock that has been in the silo that whole pause period or delay period for distribution, or you can just delay the eligibility of stock to earn beans for a full season. The latter is more aggressive in terms of minimizing inorganic demand, because in the latter case, you need to hold bean exposure, silo exposure, for a full season in order to start earning yield. Whereas currently the earned beans are not distributed until some amount of time after the sunrise call, which is the former. The seed gauge requires knowing the BDV of all the assets in the silo at the time of the sunrise in a manipulation-resistant fashion. In addition to being cleaner to implement and practice than A, the implementation of B, the latter, can more naturally support silo BDV manipulation resistance. Therefore, upon implementation of the seed gauge and LP gauge, Beanstalk will only consider BDV that was still in the silo for 2 sunrise calls, like 1 full season in practice, for distributing mints and changing LP gauge points. However, the manipulation resistance implemented is far from perfect. Manipulation resistance often comes from the consideration of more time at the cost of accuracy, as we were talking about earlier. In the case of the new minting delay strategy, the lag in logging the correct BDV for each LP can be up to 2 full seasons. This makes using the BDV of each LP token in the silo for peg maintenance that is being used quite stale. However, in practice, this only affects LPX to LPY converts, which means that the LP gauge system will be adjusting LP gauge points based on data that is at least 1 full season old, or 1 full season old. Given the slow marginal effects of changing the LP gauge points, using the slightly older data is not problematic, as if this was related to something like minting beans or soil, because Beanstalk wants to avoid minting beans when it is below V and soil when it is above V as much as possible, above peg as much as possible. And that's the prepared stuff. There are a couple of other RFCs on the docket that have been proposed. There's an upgrade to multi-flow, a migration to Wrapped Eth, change to the Fert metadata, Tractor, secure Beanstalk, and Blacklist mitigation. So we've only been on for about 60, 70 minutes so far. So I think it's probably good to start diving into some of these other ones. Does anyone here have a strong preference as to which RFC is covered? So on that front, I'm going to turn off my broadcast, learn my lesson from the previous 2 days, and I'll sort of yield to the group. If anyone has any preference, throw it in the chat, or anyone that's up here, feel free to start talking, or I can start talking about some of this stuff. Okay, cool. First is the Wrapped Eth migration. That's the first thing I want to talk about. Brina, I saw you unmuted. Did you want to talk? Feel free.
Go ahead.
No, thanks. So, Beanstalk currently has a bunch of ETH exposure, and there is an opportunity for Beanstalk to be earning not a significant amount of external yield, but still something like around 4% for staking the ETH, or exchanging the ETH for wrapped ETH. And if half of the liquidity in the system is earning 4% because it's being against wrapped ETH, that should provide something like an extra 2% yield to those LP tokens, which isn't a ton, but it would be the first proof of concept of Beanstalk distributing external yield from another protocol, in this case, Ethereum itself, which is particularly cool and aligned with Beanstalk, to the side. So I think it's really cool. One thing that I think the community should spend some time discussing is the right staking provider to go with, and which staked ETH is the optimal staked ETH to use. But think that the main idea of moving to some version of staked ETH is a wonderful idea. Of course, there are some risks associated with staking at this point. It's still relatively new, but I think it's very exciting. So not sure if anyone in particular wants to talk about the analysis that they've done on the various staking options. I personally don't feel particularly qualified to talk on that front, so I'm not going to, but that's the introduction of the wrap stake ETH migration, on my end at least.
I would just add that, it might be helpful for people to start thinking about the optimal LP geared distribution once wrapped ETH is whitelisted, or Bean wrapped ETH, the LP token is whitelisted rather. I mean, there's a couple different ways you can go about it, and probably, there are arguments that exist for both. But one way, part of this RFC, which whitelists Bean wrapped ETH, also proposes to migrate the unripe liquidity to that well, and that would result in the overwhelming majority of Bean liquidity being in the Bean wrapped ETH well. So one potential avenue for the optimal gauge points would be to the optimal gauge distribution to have a lot more wrapped ETH, which would reflect that hey, the DAO is willing to accept the risk and additional trust assumptions of having this liquidity and wrapped ETH, and accepting that trade-off in favor of the yield, and thus continue to reward conversions that allocate more and more liquidity to the Bean wrapped ETH well. Alternatively, given that there are additional trust assumptions associated with wrapped ETH, you could, I don't know, I could see a world where perhaps the optimal LP gauge distribution is actually having more liquidity in the Bean ETH well to sort of balance that out. And that would be sort of like one way to think about it would be, that would be the way of distributing the liquidity over time as more liquidity finds its way in the Beanstalk. So just something to start thinking about. I think back in the day, it might have actually been Bean Banking Refract actually that proposed this idea that eventually one day it would be very cool for, ignoring, additional trust assumptions for all the various liquid staking providers. It would be pretty cool for Beanstalk to track the staking distribution for these large, staking providers between Lido, Rapid Pool, etc., and try to decentralize the Ethereum stake to some extent. Just wanted to shout out that I thought that was a cool idea, and perhaps we get there one day. But anyway, this RFC is one step in that direction. And then if you look at the channel, there is some discussion about the various staking providers. I did a little bit of research on this, but it was quite a while ago, so don't know how much I can talk about it at a very lucid level. But there are some really great articles that were dropped in that channel with regards to the risks and trust assumptions of the different liquid staking providers.
One thing I think is worth noting about this type of thing is that the risk associated with the staking provider is really realized by Beanstalk as a whole, but so is the benefit, because the growth in the value of the LP tokens typically would increase delta B because the liquidity is increasing in value. And so there's some interesting component of the benefit is realized across Beanstalk. The risk is realized across Beanstalk, but individual participants also benefit. But they benefit insofar as the change in price of the underlying, the appreciation of their asset, but they still need to be incentivized in from some perspective to hold the yield-bearing asset, or disincentivized if there's too many risks. And so the first use of the gate system, as Guy was sort of alluding to, will be the LP of wrapped ETH versus wrapped staked ETH versus just regular ETH. So funky stuff, fun times. Yeah, it's very exciting. So get to sort of see some of that stuff in action, even if it's relatively marginal, whether Beanstalk has ETH or wrapped ETH liquidity at this point. But great to start getting the data. The other set of pools that people have been talking about are stablecoin pools, when stable swap. And so this is the Blacklist mitigation BIP, or the RFC. Maybe Guy and Breen, if you guys want to talk about some of that.
Sure. This one's still definitely, early stages on the Blacklist mitigation front, but actually quite far along on the stable swap front. I think Breen had done a fair amount of that work over the summer last year. And then it got tabled a little bit in terms of, refiguring out priorities in terms of given that whitelisting something like a Bean stablecoin, centralized stablecoin, would require something like Blacklist mitigation. It was tabled in the meantime. But definitely want to revisit it over the coming months. I guess to give a little overview of what Blacklist mitigation means. The idea is that it would add a lot of utility and be useful for farmers to be able to, get rewarded stock and seeds for providing liquidity in Bean USDC, Bean Tether wells, etc. But obviously, the existence of those wells, or not just the existence, but having those, whitelisted in the silo, presents a risk to Beanstalk if those centralized custodians, Circle and Tether, respectively, or there's plenty of other examples, or to blacklist the well, meaning making their stablecoin no longer transferable from that address. That would present the reason it would present risk to Beanstalk, because all that value in the well all the non-Bean value would essentially be frozen, and then any LPs, liquidity providers of that well could, withdraw their liquidity once cited as Bean and dump those Beans on the market. So the concept of blacklist mitigation is to say, well, if someone is going to provide liquidity to one of these wells, they're taking on the risk of, or they should take on the risk of one of those custodians blacklisting the well rather than Beanstalk as a whole. And so the idea is that
rather than Beanstalk, but in addition to Beanstalk, right? Because Beanstalk still has this exposure. If the value is lost, the liquidity is lost, but so should the depositor.
Correct. That's accurate, or more accurate. Let's say there's a situation where 80% of Bean liquidity is against Bean ETH and 20% is against Bean USDC, with or without, or rather, maybe just to start with the first example, without blacklist mitigation, if that well gets blacklisted and all the beans in that bean USDC well are dumped, I mean, I guess it depends on the liquidity to supply ratio to, determine exactly how big the dump would be. But 20% of that bean liquidity would be not just wiped out because the well is blacklisted, but then those beans could be dumped in addition. But with this change that we're dubbing blacklist mitigation, the idea is that those beans in that blacklisted well would effectively be treated as frozen or burnt by Beanstalk. And so it's unclear what the implementation will look like exactly, but one example you could imagine is that those deposits, the bean USDC LP token deposits, would not be able to be withdrawn, and then Beanstalk would not include that bean supply. It would effectively treat those beans in the well the same as beans in the null address, i.e. burned. So at a high level, that's the idea there. And until that system is in place, I think that the risk associated with whitelisting a bean centralized stablecoin well, not quite worth the risk. I think that something like this could mitigate that risk a lot.
I'm not sure if you already mentioned this, but all all deposits containing that LP token would automatically be withdrawn, so people would stop receiving yield who had deposited the LP token.
That's a great point. Obviously, whenever that well gets blacklisted, in addition to what I mentioned about not being able to withdraw it, or again, TBD on what the implementation looks like, but the goal would not be rewarding those deposits with stock receipts.
Yeah, unclear if you'd want to withdraw it entirely so that they lost the grown stock if there was sort of an unblacklisting.
Yeah, I mean, some sort of locked state, but
so just to expand a little bit on, well, there's a question of like how Beanstalk is going to detect that well has been blacklisted, which is an interesting problem in and of itself. And that hasn't necessarily been figured out, and I think that there's a lot more discussion necessary to get there. But if we think about how that works, if you think about how the USDC or tethered blacklists work in their token contracts, the token contracts for USDC and USDT, the custodians can arbitrarily upgrade those contracts, and they simply have a list of addresses. Well, I don't know, I haven't dug that much into the implementation myself, but you can imagine the way it works at a high level is that in those token contracts, there's a list, a blacklist of addresses that it checks that the tokens are not in, and if it's in those addresses, it reverts and doesn't allow transfer to execute or succeed. And Ethereum, it's not like Ethereum has some sort of standard for blacklisting addresses, and even if it did, there's nothing guaranteeing that these custodians implement that standard. It's a little bit tricky determining for Beanstalk to determine whether or not a well has been blacklisted. And then there's also the question of like when it should check. Does it only check on the sunrise or GM call, which opens up its own risk of like if the blacklisting happens at the beginning of the season, and then people can withdraw and dump for the following 58 minutes. But back to how to detect it, it's a little bit not super elegant as a solution, but perhaps the one avenue would be to have some sort of multi-sig. Unclear if it would be the DCM or some other multi-sig that is upgrading or returning some different value from a function call from a function that Beanstalk reads to detect whether or not a well has been blacklisted, and that multi-sig would be responding to whether the well has been blacklisted or not, which is likely to be, well, not just public information, but obviously the token contract to be checked if it's upgraded or not. So there's a lot there in terms of the implementation to be figured out, but those are a few ideas.
I guess just to jump in here and talk about some other solutions. I think the simplest way would be to do something as simple as just adding some sort of flag to the silo settings and an optional function selector that could be some other contractor part of Beanstalk, where it would just be a function that checks the blacklist for each token that has been whitelisted that has the potential of being blacklisted. And in terms of when to do it, it's probably safest to do it every time someone interacts with such a token, whether that's deposit, withdraw, convert, and root, etc. And anytime anyone interacts with a whitelisted token that has the potential to become blacklisted, it performs the blacklist check. If it is blacklisted, it triggers this event that occurs when Beanstalk determines a token to be blacklisted and blocks withdrawing of it, invalidates all tokens in the pool, etc. And so I don't think it should be too difficult to do. Whether there's a generalized solution that automatically can handle all different ways a token can be blacklisted is probably going to be more difficult to do. But as always, a modular approach would work fine.
Yeah, and just to make it clear why Beanstalk couldn't just necessarily check the existing blacklists for USDC and Tether is that they could simply implement, some different kind of blacklist to get around Beanstalk's, simple detection mechanism of whether the wells are included in the existing Tether or Circle blacklists. Which, maybe just to point out is like, yeah, these are all very clearly, I don't know if I would refer to them as long shot scenarios, but Beanstalk operates in a adversarial environment, and that's only going to become more true as Beanstalk gains more attention and grows. And these are the types of risks that, in my opinion, are worth accounting for. Especially before Beanstalk has all that attention.
Thank you, Guy. I appreciate that very much and agree wholeheartedly. These are the types of things to put in place before Beanstalk is highly scrutinized. So, there's 4 RFCs remaining.
Well, before we move on, I think Pizza Man had at least one question. He says, couldn't they currently blacklist 3 curve? But don't we already have blacklist exposure and the risk was not greater than the reward? Certainly, any of those custodians could have blacklisted 3 curve, although that would have been, as part of their calculus, that'd be more like an attack on DeFi than an attack on Beanstalk. And Circle and Tether blacklist addresses all the time. I was actually quite surprised to learn this. I think there's some Twitter bots or Telegram bots that track this, and they go off daily or weekly at least. We just don't necessarily hear about the smaller ones, but certainly blacklisting 3 curve would be difficult to imagine their business going very well after that. But anyway, so don't we already have blacklist exposure? Yeah, but again, I guess related to my earlier answer, I would argue that some sort of attack like that on Beanstalk is much more likely than that of 3 curve. And the risk of being not greater than the reward. I mean, as mentioned, Beanstalk doesn't have that much attention or scrutiny right now.
And maybe, just to say it, once the blacklist mitigation system is implemented, something, an implementation of it could be applied to 3 curve, such that Beanstalk would, have some sort of, way to get out of blacklist situation of 3 curve itself.
Although I think at this point, it seems like most of the community is in agreement, 3 curve is unnecessary risk. I think the intention is actually, as part of the gauge system, to propose to de-whitelist it.
Yeah, as currently implemented, deploying the Z gauge bit will also de-whitelist tree curve. But we'll retain their grown stock in the silo, so they will still continue getting yield, but will not receive any grown stock.
And I agree with Safi. It would be unfortunate for their grown stock to be permanently lost. Depositors of the Bean stablecoin, Bean blacklisted stablecoin pairs. Pizza Man asks, so basically set the seeds to 0 for the Bean 3 curve pool. Brandon, can you remind me, does de-whitelisting have the stock to 0 as well? Or do people still have the stock? I believe they still keep their stock.
Yeah, they'll still retain their stock.
Great. Good.
All right. Sorry, Pizza Man. Didn't mean to skip your question. Appreciate it.
I mean, set seed to 0 and just and block new deposits of the token also. And I guess just to answer your question above, like Beanstalk has to reveal their mechanism for checking the blacklist, and if anyone wanted to get around it, they could come up with something that gets around Beanstalk's check, so Beanstalk will always lose. I mean, this definitely speaks to the complication of the blacklist mitigation system. Perhaps just to talk about like what it means for something to actually be blacklisted would be that tokens cannot be transferred to or from the well. And I would imagine that there's some way to make the blacklist check that tokens can be transferred to or from the well, whether that's through like some temporary addition and immediate removal of liquidity from the pool or something. But yeah, I mean, definitely a lot of thought needs to go into creating a way to check that the blacklist itself is valid, such that there's no way to circumvent it through a future upgrade of the USDC or USDT contract.
Thank you, Brendan. All right. Next, this is a lighter RFC, the Fert metadata. Brendan, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I mean, going back to like fertilizer was originally created for the purpose of the barn raise, and while the barn raise was being developed, kind of there wasn't quite the development effort required. The goal was to get the protocol back up and running with a proper economic mechanism, mechanisms with proper economic incentives as soon as possible. And unfortunately, bells and whistles such as putting the fertilizer metadata on chain were avoided at the time. And currently, there is a centralized server that is operated by Beanstalk Farms on which all the fertilizer metadata is stored. Now, obviously, this isn't ideal. And kind of in the creation of Silo v3, deposits became ERC 1155 tokens. And with the implementation of tokenized deposits, the deposit metadata was stored on chain. So this is definitely something that is possible. The developer community surrounding Beanstalk has some experience with, and definitely should be done to fertilizer. Having any sort of reliance on any sort of centralized server is not ideal. And even though this is just metadata information, which could be determined from on-chain calls already by just querying, the fertilizer ID, what the amount of rinsable sprouts that have already been given to a given fertilizer, etc. The metadata could be recreated in a trustless fashion using these on-chain values. It still makes sense to put the metadata on chain in a format that can be interpreted by off-chain NFT exchanges such as OpenSea without having to have that additional trust assumption. This is something that the moment it was brought up, it was very clear that it's something that it seemed like it makes sense to add to Beanstalk. And, unfortunately, it doesn't seem like there has been a development effort yet to implement this. But
Just wanted to shout out Dead Man regards to Fert metadata. I believe he's working on that currently, and I think he's close to finalizing that. So very excited for him regarding the Fert metadata.
Great. If there's nothing else to add on the Fert metadata, the next RFC to cover, there's only 3 left, I believe. Why don't we talk about the multi-flow upgrade? Brendan, if you want to talk about this and how it's a response to the recent EBIFs that went out.
So the original multi-flow pump capped the actual reserve balances of the pool. Now, what this means is, say we have a 2-token pool, the cap that was implemented by the multi-flow pump, and maybe let's take a step back and talk about what the cap actually is. So historically, oracles have used statistical aggregators such as means and medians to prevent manipulation of an oracle value. This, worked pretty well and started with Uniswap v2 when they introduced the ability to query an arithmetic mean over some period of time. You would snapshot some start period, and then when you wanted to query the average over that period, you would input the start snapshot, and it would give you kind of the average over the period. This is the type of oracle that was used in the original Beanstalk implementation when it was first deployed. Kind of since then, Uniswap v3 switched to a geometric mean, but not much change has been done to on-chain oracle since then. I think it was about a year ago, Ethereum went through the merge, and in the merge, a more deterministic structure to who has the ability to propose each block was introduced. Pre-merge, Ethereum used proof of work, which means that it was fairly random who would have the ability to add the next block. So no operator could guarantee that they would receive the ability to propose multiple blocks in a row. Post-merge, each 32 block epoch, who has the ability to propose each of these blocks is determined ahead of time. So a particular operator may know ahead of time that they have control over multiple blocks within the Ethereum network. Now, these, kind of statistical averages worked very well at protecting against flash loans by, averaging over time and not including inter-block balances in that average. However, with the introduction of the ability for an operator to propose multiple blocks in a row, it became possible to manipulate balances and liquidity pools to whatever the operator wants for a non-zero period of time. Now, as these averages are simple, arithmetic or geometric means of, let's say, an hour, manipulating the balance to be, 1,000 times higher than it should be for a single block, averaged across 300 blocks, is still a very substantial increase, something like 30 something times. Or I guess it would just be 3 point something times. And, kind of what this did is it essentially invalidated all on-chain oracles. With the introduction of Basin, significant research was done into investigating ways to mitigate specifically this multi-block MEV attack. And the way that was landed on was limiting the change in the values that the arithmetic and geometric mean read from block to block. So the original mechanism that was used was simply limiting how much each individual reserve could change. I think it's something like 0.1% a block currently. And this works great to present manipulation, but it also introduced a new kind of bug in the sense that when we look at what an on-chain protocol like Beanstalk needs to know from a price oracle, it's two things. Generally, it's one, some sort of rate of exchange of assets, which is indicative of the ratio between tokens in the pool, or the ratio of tokens in the pool is indicative of the exchange rate. And then secondly, the magnitude of tokens in the pool, how much liquidity there is. Now, for instance, in the case of BDV, it reads the exchange rate. In the case of convert or minting, it reads delta B, which is a function of the current exchange rate, or ratio of tokens in the pool, and how many tokens there are in the pool, which determines how quickly that exchange rate moves as you trade across it. So, kind of by capping strictly the balances in the pool, it wasn't we didn't quite look at what the oracle actually needed to read and kind of take that approach. And it led to this problem that we saw when the liquidity was migrated from Bean ETH to Bean Steth, where both balances of tokens in the pool were capped at the same time, and therefore each block the balances would both increase by the same amount. Now this led to a problem where, as price discovery continued in the actual liquidity pool, it wasn't reflected in the capped reserve of tokens in the pool, as the real balances were something like 100x times the capped balances. And so therefore each block, the cap balances would just increase by the maximum amount, and the ratio between them as determined by the oracle would remain the same, even though there had been real price discovery in the well that shifted the balances to be different. So what this means is, while the balances are capped, especially in the same direction, either they're both too high or they're both too low, the oracle is not a proper indicator of the price of a given token, or the ratio, the exchange rate, or the integral of. A simple potential solution might be to, just turn the oracles off whenever the balances are capped. However, this introduces another attack vector where someone could force the balances to become capped and therefore DOS the protocol by not allowing the oracles to be read, and that also introduces a problem. So a full redesign of this cap mechanism has been done, where both the ratio between tokens and the overall quantity of tokens in the pool have their own independent caps. Now, what this in practice does is allows both the ratio between tokens to move when the total amount of tokens in the pool is capped, and allows the total amount of tokens in the pool to move when the ratio between tokens is capped. So overall, this gives well deployers much more flexibility in the sense that they can now customize the parameters of how fast the total liquidity pool and the ratio between tokens change independently. And this should in practice lead to significant more manipulation resistance, as well deployers can put harsher caps on changes in magnitude of LP tokens, while potentially a lighter cap on the change in ratios, as the real problem comes when the ratio in the liquidity pool, or the ratio of tokens returned by the pump, do not match the ratio of tokens in the actual well. So development on this is pretty much done. and should be used in the implementation of the Beans Teeth pool, which is pretty exciting.
Thank you for all that. That is, I agree, it's super exciting. Obviously, the pump is a very important part of on-chain activity in the EVM, as we understand it, and this is a usability issue that we discovered in production. And yeah, I think this is a very good solution. So excited that it's almost done. Doesn't seem like we have any questions on that.
Brendan, do you want to talk about the concept of making Beanstalk the owner of the new multi-flow?
Yeah, so kind of the unfortunate nature of the mechanisms of the pump still kind of being battle tested in real world environments, combined with the fact that Basin was deployed with unupgradable contracts, makes it quite difficult to iterate. For instance, to move the existing Bean ETH pool to a new Bean ETH pool will require deploying an entire new Bean ETH pool and then having, through some sort of upgrade, having Beanstalk move on behalf of farmers all their underlying liquidity in the Bean ETH pool to a new pool, and then individually migrating their deposits to the new token. This is a process that is gonna that has significant development overhead and more significant overhead to do it in a way such that it's easily repeatable. And kind of, it doesn't make sense to stick with the existing Bean ETH pool because the pump that's attached to it has these inherent flaws, that could lead to potential problems in the future. And so therefore, it definitely makes sense to migrate the Bean ETH pool. Now, given that, this Oracle mechanism is still being significantly battle tested, the idea to deploy the wells as upgradable has been discussed. Now, the main reason for why, this decision is being considered, is that, Beanstalk is that the majority of liquidity sitting in the Bean ETH well and the future Beans Teeth well is in Beanstalk, which means whatever governance mechanism Beanstalk has pretty much has agency over all of the LP tokens already. So by deploying the wells as upgradable and making the owner of the wells Beanstalk, there's very little additional security assumptions introduced, as Beanstalk itself custodies all deposited Bean ETH. So having Beanstalk essentially custody all Bean ETH is not much more risky. It should obviously be said that any non-Bean pools can be deployed as upgradable. Basin contains Aquifer, which allows the deployment of any well implementation, any well, any pump. So this, decision is obviously only being considered for Bean pools. But, kind of the hope is that if there is an issue with the multi-flow pump or even the well going forward, that, the DAO will be able to fix these issues more quickly through having direct governance control instead of having to redeploy an entire new well and having to migrate all existing liquidity.
Wonderful. Thank you. We have 2 RFCs left to cover. We're approaching the 2-hour mark, but think it may make sense to just power through. Why don't we start with 1 and see how far we get? How does that sound?
Sounds good. And maybe we start with secure Beanstalk because I think Tractor has been discussed several times before on DAO calls. in class. So just going to jump into that. As we've seen, historically, there's a lot of risk associated with storing all of the value, locked and stored in Beanstalk directly in the Beanstalk protocol. Obviously, in the exploit, we saw all the non-Bean underlying liquidity taken out of Beanstalk. Recently, there was an Immunify report that was deemed valid that found a bug that was capable of taking all of the beans out of Beanstalk. So, naturally, a lot of thought continues to go into how to make the process of developing, implementing, and deploying new BIBs safer. Historically, the Beanstalk development community has placed a very strong emphasis on gas efficiency. In the original deployment of Beanstalk, there were very few, there were very few unnecessary components to the protocol that weren't, related to core computation, components that were unnecessary. However, over time, from my perspective, the general consensus of the Beanstalk development community has moved towards one where, or has become more aware of the high cost of development and the potential costs of poor security. And for this reason, there's been kind of a shift towards, simplicity in implementation and potentially adding extra bells and whistles that prevent the magnitude of potential exploits. Instead of, adding, 20, 30 lines of code to save 100 gas here, just do it in one line of code and let that extra gas is okay. Specifically in the context of how many upgrades have been continued to be implemented to Beanstalk, where, you write these 20 lines of code to save 100 gas, and then 3 bips later, that code gets deleted. And if you aggregate how much money was saved from that 100 gas, it equates to cents or dollars. And compare that to, the amount of development time that went to designing, implementing those 20 lines of codes, the amount of audit time that went towards checking that lines of codes, the amount of time that went into code reviews, it's quite significant. So for that reason, it seems like, over time, less of a focus has started to be placed on gas efficiency. In addition, on the context of security, you factor in the size and quantity of how much money Beanstalk has already spent in security costs from the exploit, from Immunify. It's significantly more by orders of magnitude than all of the Ethereum that has been the value of the Ethereum that has been spent in transaction fees to use Beanstalk. So based on this perspective, the idea to implement a mechanism that can help cap the magnitude of a potential attack on Beanstalk, has been proposed. And this mechanism would, add gas costs to every single function that Beanstalk uses, probably in the 5 figures. But again, if you aggregate that gas cost over all the transactions and compare that to the the security the potential loss of value through poor security that Beanstalk is protecting against, it seems like it might be worth implementing. So to summarize what, several ideas have been discussed, but the one that seems to make the most sense is currently Beanstalk as a contract has no notion of what the value stored in it is. It knows it has, say 30 million beans in its contract, but it doesn't know the breakdown of what those beans belong to. It doesn't know how many beans are deposited. It doesn't know how many beans are part of pod orders. It doesn't know how many beans are harvestable beans. So kind of, the proposal is to implement some sort of Beanstalk native accounting system where Beanstalk now classifies what each and every bean is. This bean is a deposited bean. This bean is a farm bean. This bean is part of a pod order. And essentially, at the end of every transaction, it would check that the sum of beans in Beanstalk, and not just beans, but other tokens too, whitelisted silo tokens and potentially farm tokens, that the sum of all of the different states of those tokens is less than or equal to the amount of beans that Beanstalk holds. Now, what this means is that an exploiter would not be able to take tokens out of Beanstalk without also manipulating the accounting system, first of all, which means, like, say there's a way to just take beans from the contract through, having some control of execution flow, or having some control of some transfer function. Unless it also has the ability to deduct, say deposited silo beans, it's unable to take any beans at all, which is, a significant improvement. In addition, if someone does have the ability to manipulate an accounting variable, let's say, they're able to cancel and withdraw the beans on pod order holders on behalf of other farmers, then the maximum amount of beans they can take from the contract are the beans that are stored in pod holders or stored in pod orders. Let's say they can, remove more beans than are, they could cancel a pod order and receive a theoretical infinite amount of beans. They'd be limited by how many beans in Beanstalk's internal accounting system are actually classified as beans stored in pod orders. Now, retroactively applying, this update to Beanstalk and seeing how it holds up, it seems like it would, significantly reduce the amount of beans that have been paid out for immunified bug bounties, and just in general of exploits found, reduce the maximum impact of all of them. And on top of that, the amount of development effort to implement this solution is quite minimal relative to some of other proposed changes. It strictly requires adding this accounting system every time tokens are moved around, implementing and subtracting from the accounting variables, and then adding this check, which checks the amount of accounting, which performs the accounting check at the end of every function to make sure that the balance sheet in Beanstalk is valid. Now, other potential ideas have been to split up tokens into separate contracts, split up logic across separate contracts. These are also good ideas, but when evaluating them, it seems like the relative increase of security compared to this accounting system is quite minimal, and development effort would be much significantly higher and more complex, which again, the goal is to try to avoid, as simplicity seems to be very important to the development community. I guess any questions on that or comments? Great. Doesn't seem like anyone's typing, but happy to participate in any discussion on that, in the RFC. I guess just to briefly touch on Tractor. Tractor is a peer-to-peer, marketplace that is very similar to an order book where people can create blueprints. A blueprint is a set of, is some sort of on-chain execution function calls, and those function calls can be anything. Combined with a set of inputs that another party inputs when they want to fulfill the blueprint. Now, what that means is I can create, a two-sided transaction that has the potential to perform actions on my behalf and have access to my assets. Now, this transaction can also perform actions on behalf of another party or have access to the assets of another party. And the parameters of those actions that are function calls and or the parameters of the assets of mine to use and the quantity of assets to use are inputs that can all be customized by either me as the creator or input by the fulfiller of the blueprint. And any sort of arbitrary logic or checks can be added to the blueprint to make sure that any inputs by the fulfilling party are valid. Now, this has been, I think, discussed in depth in previous classes, but it does require a significant amount of off-chain work to actually create an order book. The only thing that's on-chain is order execution, which means that creating orders is very cheap. Executing and canceling orders is required to be done on-chain and updating. And given that these functions can contain any arbitrary logic, this allows for a marketplace to be built for any asset or any on-chain action. In the context of Beanstalk, most notably, this is automating things like plant and mow. As a first step, plant, mow, and root. Kind of automating farming. Going back to the list of potential future upgrades to Beanstalk we talked about, things like plant and mow are totally unnecessary from the design perspective. They are only exist due to mathematical limitations of complexity. And, ideally, the system automatically plants and mows. And that's another potential avenue for research of creating efficient math that can automatically perform that. But until then, we can create this pseudo-automated farming through creating these markets for plants, mow, and roots. On top of that, a convert order book can be created where farmers can specify, at what price levels, at what delta B, etc. They are willing to convert their assets into anything once generalized convert is introduced. As well as creating highly customizable marketplaces for deposits, plots, and fertilizer. As we've talked about in previous classes, there are some major limitations to the existing pod marketplace, namely that you can't create n-dimensional orders. And you can't even use deposited beans. You can only use circulating tokens. Through Tractor, you will be able to use beans that are in any state. You can use the same beans across any number of orders, which creates, high capital efficiency, which is all very exciting. So guess we'll leave it there unless there's anything in relation to Tractor that people want to talk about. But development has been well underway. Thunderbroker is doing a great job ironing out those contracts and getting that going. So super excited about Tractor. Know that's something that's been an idea floating around for a long, long time. So seeing it start to come to fruition and more conversation around it is super exciting.
Yeah, a lot of ideas that have been floating around for a long time seem to be coming to fruition. It's all it's clear that there's so many interesting things to be worked on at this point. It's just Beanstalk is ripe, if you will, for continued discovery. So it's super exciting. Hope everyone enjoyed the discussion on the state space and the seed gauge and generalized convert and all these other RFCs. As questions arise, please feel free to tag us. Wonderful. Thank you all so much. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks, everyone.